So we're very happy to welcome Anne back. She was here last year for the wonderful knitting book, which we have some copies of around the corner. And this is a whole other genre. She's back to writing fiction. Anne, I read her blog, or her site today, and said she's always wanted to be a writer ever since she was a little girl, and she discovered the Nancy Drew books, which I'm sure a lot of us also discovered, but not necessarily wanted to. There's a spot right there for you. Wanted to be writers. She's a Rhode Island native and grew up in West Warwick, where she actually, in Warwick, she was a model for the Jordan Marsh stores. Jordan Marsh still exists? Of course it does. No, it doesn't.
No.
That's what I thought. And then I thought, wow.
They are gone. And their muffins are too. The blueberry muffins.
Well, she majored in English at the University of Rhode Island, and then deciding that if she was going to be a writer, she needed to learn, she needed to travel and get a lot of experience. So she became a flight attendant. Was it called that then? Or
Yeah,
was it called?
no, it was a flight attendant.
She became a flight attendant for TWA, and her first book, which I loved, Somewhere Off the Coast of Maine, was written mainly on international flights. Anne has received many literary prizes, and they're really quite varied. I was interested to find that she won 2 Best American Food Writing Awards, Travel Writing Awards, Best American Spiritual Award, and 2 Pushcart Prizes. She's also written 8 books, including, as I mentioned, the wonderful book, Knitting Yarns, Writers on Knitting. Please welcome Anne to the Norwich Bookstore, her second time.
I love the new space.
Yeah.
This is great. So roomy. I know. I had to bring an Italian wife with me, so this is my mother. This is Go-Go, who, like, you know, I'm hearing the bio, she's like, that's right. She modeled for Jordan Marsh, that's right. So thank you so much for coming, and go for the gelato on September 20th. That sounds great. I'm so happy to be here and so excited about the new book, but I have to tell you, Knitting Yarns, the anthology, 27 writers writing about knitting. I don't know if you guys have seen it. Even non-knitters like it, but it's got wonderful writers. You were here last time, weren't you? Yeah. It's got yeah, you were too. It's got wonderful writers in it. Ann Patchett and Barbara Kingsolver and Andre Dubusse III. Well, I'm really excited to tell you there's going to be a second anthology. It's called Knitting Pearls. And we have, like, equally as amazing writers, including the kind of local Jodi Picoult is in it, Jane Hamilton, Jane Green, Steve Almond, Nick Flynn. I mean, another amazing, Laura Lippman, another amazing group of writers writing about knitters. Now, I have to say, they're not all knitters, like they're interlopers. But when that book came out, my inbox was flooded with people saying, I want to be in the next one. And I was like, there isn't a next one, you know. But when I had 17 of these amazing writers' names, I asked my editor if she'd be interested. And her response is always no. She's that person, like, no. Even when I came up with the first idea at a lunch, I said, I had this great idea, writers writing about knitting. And she was like, she made a noise. She goes, So I said, great. And I went and emailed everybody. And it was kind of a repeat. I said, I think we should do a second one. And she was like, And then I said, I've got these 17 writers already. She's like, yes, we are going to do that book. And so I'm up again to 25, including Roseanne Cash. I mean, it's a crazy array of people. Melissa Leo, the actress, wants to be in it. I'm like, you're not a writer. I don't know what you do, but you've won an Oscar. That's good. I don't know. So I've got sort of an interesting group coming up for the second one. It's called Knitting Pearls, and it'll be out next fall. So I hope you all like it. So I'm going to talk to you about, I promised my mother I wouldn't read any of the dirty parts. So I won't do that. But I am going to tell you a little bit about how this book came to be written, because it's kind of a funny story. I am Italian-American, as you can tell by the way I talk like this. And I have to say that I actually have not written that much about being Italian-American or about that heritage. I've written an essay about my mother's meatballs that was incredibly popular, where I published her recipe. She just forgave me like a week ago for that. And a couple other things where I talk about my Italian heritage, but mostly in my fiction, I have not explored that. Well, one day I was at my mom's, and this is like 15 years ago, and she happened to tell me a story about how her grandmother, so my great-grandmother, and her mother, my grandmother, were supporters of Mussolini. And I was like, what? And she said, well, many Italian Americans supported Mussolini, you know, and they sent their gold to him. And this kind of blew me away. And I had stopped to visit her because I was on my way to Yaddo, which is, you guys might know, McDowell's nearby. Yaddo's similar, you know, an artist colony. And I was on my way to finish a book. So you get these 2 weeks to just write. And I got there, and total approach avoidance. I kept thinking about this Mussolini business. I was like, that's really interesting. So instead of finishing my book, I went to the Saratoga Springs Library, and I read like every biography of Mussolini and every book about Italian-American immigrants, and just kind of collecting information. I didn't know why. And then I wrote this story called Dear Mussolini. And it was about a family, an Italian-American family in the 30s. Not my family, I just had that germ of a story, you know, that Italian-Americans in general had done this. And I created a story around it, which is what you do in fiction. You know, you take like this little kernel of something real, and then you make up stuff. Eudora Welty said, fiction, you get to lie. And that's what I was doing. So I wrote this story, and then I did finish that book, and I was delighted the story was not only published, but it won this prize, like Best New England Short Fiction of whatever year that was. It was a long, long time ago. And it became a pattern. I had a deadline. I would think about those characters I had created, and I'd write another story in no chronological order. Some were during World War I, some during World War II, and some during the Vietnam War. So wars seemed to be the thing that was kind of unifying it, at least for me. Last year I wrote a story called Captain Macaroni. It's one of the stories from the 70s. And I put it in this file. You know, I just kept throwing them in the file, which is called Dear Mussolini. And many of the stories were published, you know, so it wasn't like I was just writing them and hiding them. They were out there. And I put this story in, and I looked down, and the page count was 320 pages. And I was like, I have 320 pages of these stories? So I printed them out, and I kind of laid them out on my dining room table, and I organized them because, as I said, I didn't write them in any order. They centered around wars, but I might write one from the 70s and one from the 30s. You know, I wasn't doing them consciously. And I rearranged them, and I thought two of the stories were pretty weak. No surprise, those two had never sold anywhere. And I, you know, ditched those. And I wrote a new story, and I looked and I said, wow, this is like a family saga. I mean, this tells the story, and it covers roughly 100 years in the life of this family I made up. And I have to tell you that a lot of the stories, again, came from just a kernel of something that I felt or knew or had heard. You know, a story from the old country. For example, the main character, Josephine, was a shepherdess in her village in Italy, and my great-grandmother had been a shepherdess in her village. So, you know, a lot of the facts are right, but I just kept making up stories and expanding this family. So I sent it to my agent, and she's tough. You know, she's often like, what are you doing? What is this? Wow, have you lost your mind? You know, she talks like that. And I only do one accent. That's it. So everybody has that accent. So I sent it to her with no explanation. I just said, what do you think? And she emailed me back pretty quickly and said, well, I love it, but when did you have time to write a novel? And I said, well, I've been working on this for 15 years, you know, in this sort of backdoor way, writing other books. But it would be like my secret pleasure to just write another story about this family I had created. So she said, I'm going to send it to Jill, my editor, the one who goes, and I'm going to do the same thing you did to me. I'm just going to say, what do you think? And Jill came back with, yeah, let's negotiate. I want to buy this. So all of a sudden, I had maybe a novel. They were stories to me. Wally Lamb, that wonderful Italian-American, who would know? His last name is Lamb. In fact, he said to me, who would know it, kid? A lamb in a hood, but we're Italian. But he said this wonderful quote after he read the book, which was that it reminded him of Olive Kitteridge. You know, that Liz Strout book, in that the stories hang together and tell a bigger tale. Is it exactly a novel? Well, they didn't put a novel on the front. You know, it is a family saga, told, I think, in these stories, these connected stories. And I'm going to read to you, I've pieced together, you can see all my Post-its, because I want to really give a taste of what the book is like. We follow Josephine Romaldi from the late 1800s, when she's in Italy and has an arranged marriage very typical in those days, not in my family actually, but that day in the Saratoga Springs Library when I read all those books in my notes, you would get married and then the husband would come and work in the mills and save enough money to buy a house and send for you, and sometimes this took 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, you know, in her case it was 7 years before she was sent to come and live in Rhode Island. I based it on the little town where I grew up. My little neighborhood was completely Italian-American. You know, when I walked down the street, I heard Italian. I saw the little old ladies with their black kerchiefs. I saw grape vines everywhere. I saw amazing tomato plants and rich, rich gardens. And the first time I went to southern Italy, I looked around and I said, this looks exactly like home to me. So they had moved there to work in the mills and recreated their village. You know, and they were all from the same basic areas of southern Italy, you know, the mass exodus in the late 1800s, for many immigrants, not just Italians. One of the things that I was really interested in as I wrote these stories was something that I always felt, which was this kind of straddling of your culture, like sort of the old world and the new world. And it feels weird as someone who was born in the late 50s and grew up very modern American. But I lived with my grandmother and my great-grandmother and 2 great-uncles and a great-aunt and so many cousins and aunts and uncles all around us. My mother still lives in the house where she was born, and it was the house that my great-grandparents bought when they came from Italy. She and her 9 siblings, she's going to make comments the whole time. If you want to really be interested, you should lean this way. Once during a reading, I have to tell you, she got up and she said, can you finish? I'm done. I was like, Mom, we're not done. I mean, I have to sign books. She's like, well, I'm going outside. This is taking too long. So anything can happen. But she and her 9 siblings were actually born in that house, in the room where we now sit and watch TV. And she just had her 83rd birthday. And my grandmother named her 10 kids in like the traditional Italian way, where it's like one is after your husband's father, and then your father, and your husband's mother, and your mother. She knows, right? Yeah, you got it. And then after you, and after him, and you get it down. And so my mom's number 9, and they'd done it all, run out of names. And she's like, whatever, you know. And then she looked out the window, and the morning glories had just bloomed. So she named her Gloria. Oh. Is that beautiful? Yeah. Oy, we're in trouble. She hasn't even had a drink yet. Just wait. So I grew up in this, you know, family where Italian was still spoken, although my generation, they did not want us to learn Italian, right? It was kind of lost. Which is so sad because it's the most beautiful language, not to insult any of your heritages, but I just, you know, when I am in Italy and that beautiful language like falls over me, it's like a beautiful rain, you know, it's so beautiful. But I always felt this foot in the old school, foot in the modern world. I mean, I wanted to be part of the Brady Bunch, but we were living with all these, you know, elders, and we did not have a furnace until I was in 3rd or 4th grade, because my great-grandmother was afraid of them. She used an outhouse, which was in our yard, so you would say, like, to the people, you know, your friends, they said, well, where do you live? And I'm like, the house with the outhouse. I mean, that's embarrassing. You don't want that. I told this to a middle school once, and when they wrote their thank you letters, they said, your life on the prairie sounds so interesting. And I was like, oh, I forgot to tell them, no, we were in the middle of a town. We were not on the prairie. We were, like, in town. They had all these beautiful gardens. They raised chickens, and all of it made me feel not American, you know, slightly embarrassed. So the day Michelle Kincaid invited me in 3rd grade to her house, I was so happy. She was the most popular kid. I used to think the Beatles wrote the song Michelle for her, because she told everybody that. And I was like completely a sucker. I was like, yeah, they did. Michelle, my belle, you're so beautiful, you know. So I go to her house, and it's in the new part of town. It's a split ranch. And I remember you walking downstairs, I was like, this is like a palace. I mean, architecture can stop right now. This is the most beautiful thing. We walked up the stairs, and I just remember seeing like this quilt of wall-to-wall carpeting. You know, this mauve, and then like sky blue, and then this sort of coffee color down here. You know, we had hardwood floors, how beautiful, you know, but I was like, this is amazing. And then she had a dishwasher, and it was churning away. She was already regretting inviting me because I was kind of like gobsmacked, you know, standing there. And I said, what is that? And she said, it's a dishwasher. And I said, it's washing your dishes? And she's like, don't you have to leave? And this is terrible. Now, in my mind, I would leave for school and my grandmother would be like wringing chickens' necks out in the backyard. Out comes, you know, and like swearing in Italian, out comes Michelle Kincaid's grandmother. And she's like right out of central casting. You know, she has a gray bun and like little wire rim glasses, and she's got this beautiful apron, and she has this tray of snickerdoodles, like a cookie I still can't even bear because of this day, you know. And she's like, snickerdoodle, and I got a stomach ache. I said, I have to go home. I was so jealous of like this American vision, you know. And I ran all the way home, and we always enter through the kitchen. I mean, we're Italian, and I go in the kitchen door, and Mama Rose, my grandmother, is stirring something in a pot, like one of the witches from Macbeth, you know. But it's like red sauce, but like rabbit or lungs or something, you know. And she swears at me in Italian, and I say, I hate my life. And I run upstairs, and I write my first short story. And it was about a little girl who comes home, and her grandmother has disappeared. Now, I'm Italian, so I'm very superstitious. Nothing bad happened. She just was like gone. And the little girl's life gets so much better. For one thing, she gets a dishwasher. And for a second thing, she ate snickerdoodles every day after school. And I wrote this story. The first story, a long hand in this purple notebook. I'm 8 years old. And I remember I came downstairs and like the whole world looked like it had shifted on its axis. Like writing that story gave me this incredible, almost power to better understand the world around me. And I realized I was a kid who already was a huge reader. And I used to read when I wanted to escape. Not that I had anything terrible to escape from, but just, you know, you want to kind of go away. So I realized I could read if I wanted to escape, and I could write to help me understand the world in which I lived. And that story that day is what opened that up to me. And for like 3 years, I wrote disappearing grandmother stories every day. You know, Civil War, gone. You know, Victorian England, gone. Amazon River grandmother, everything, gone, gone, gone. Until I had worked my way to the point where suddenly I wanted to know her better. You know, and I luckily got to hear so many of her stories, which influenced so much of what is in an Italian life. I will say that I moved on to trying to understand girls and friendships when I was in middle school. All my stories were about why Karen Heck doesn't like me anymore, you know, all these stories. And I don't think it's I don't think it's a coincidence that so much of what I write about is trying to understand women and how women's place in the world and in families and in their friendships. And An Italian Wife is about that too. Josephine has 6 daughters, but she has a daughter, the 6th daughter, who came from an illicit love affair. And the priest helps her to give that daughter up for adoption and helps her falsify the papers so that it appears she was stillborn. So it never comes out that she was even born. Her children don't even know. And the part I'm going to read you is how that sort of happened and what happened later, because it gives you a sense of the 3 sections of the book. The first section, which is when she has that baby and meets that man, has that baby, and then later when she begins to look for her at a time when it's almost impossible. I also wanted to read this because part of it takes place in Vermont. One of her daughters becomes a nun and is sent to a church that I completely made up in Montpelier, Vermont. And so her first trip to Vermont is for that daughter's, what do you call it, not initiation, but you know, to become a nun. So she has come with another daughter of hers, Elisabetta, who wants so badly to be American that she's changed her name to Betsy. And she and Betsy go on a train to Vermont for the sisters, you know, entering into nunhood. But she knows that that's where her baby was placed, in Vermont. So I'm just going to read you this section, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. It's all clean, Mom, don't worry. Shaking her head. Years later, Josephine would think of that summer of 1918 as the summer of ice. Already it had become the summer of the Great War. People blamed everything on the fact that the world had gone mad. Dogs howled into the night. Hail as big as plums fell from the sky, not once, but twice that summer. Father Leone held special masses to pray for the boys going off to war. The village filled the church for those masses, crying as Father Leone, with his head of slick, wavy hair and his large, drooping handlebar mustache, invoked the names of the town boys who had gone. It was said that the Virgin Mary cried real tears after these masses. A special representative from the Boston Archdiocese was coming to investigate. But for Josephine, even with the howling dogs and brutal hail, even with the weeping Virgin and her own son Carmine, old enough to join the army, that summer was ordinary until Alfredo Petrocelli, the Iceman, did not show up as usual one day. No ice for a week in June meant meat went bad. Drinks grew warm. Everything had to be eaten right away. There were rumors that Alfredo Petrocelli had the Spanish influenza and would surely die. But Josephine chose not to believe this. She thought of his cool hands, his muscles straining as he hoisted blocks of ice, his clean, clear face. If anyone got the Spanish influenza, surely it would be that filthy coal man. The next Friday morning, with all of the children at school or at work in the mill, Josephine was surprised when she heard noise in the backyard. She stepped outside, still in her thin house dress, and found a man who was not Alfredo Petrocelli, standing with a block of ice. Aware of the sweat marks staining under her arms and of her flimsy dress, Josephine folded her arms across her chest. "You there," she called to the man. "You startled me." He turned, tall with blonde hair and green eyes, staring back at her from a tanned face. The man in the black pants and white sleeveless t-shirt was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Sorry," he said in English, "I don't know the drill." Josephine frowned. "The drill?" she repeated. "I'm filling in for my cousin Al," the man said in rapid-fire English with no hint of an Italian accent, an American. "He's pretty sick." He studied her for a minute, then laughed. "You don't know a word I'm saying, do you?" She shrugged and took a tentative step toward him. That's when she realized she was barefoot, and her legs were bare as well. Bare arms, bare legs, no shoes, a flimsy dress. What was this man going to think of her? He was looking at her, and a blush rose on his cheeks. "Sorry to stare," he said in terrible Italian, "but you're beautiful." Now color rose in her cheeks. "No," she said, waving his compliment away with her hands. He grabbed one of her hands, and before she could pull it away, he was shaking it and saying, "Tommy Petrocelli, your new temporary Iceman." "Your Italian's awful," she told him. "Sorry," he said again. "I was born in the good old US of A. My father's Al's father's brother." "Tio," he said. "Tio," she said, "uncle." He laughed. "Your English is terrible," he said. "My mother's French," he told her, "but she's been here forever." Josephine nodded, even though she had no idea what French was. "Do you want to come inside for a drink?" she asked him. "Sure," he said. "Great." He still held on to her hand, and when they both realized this, he dropped it quickly. Sitting in her hot kitchen at the table, beads of sweat on his forehead, he quickly drank the lemonade she gave him. They sat quietly. "Even the glass is sweating," Josephine said finally, pointing. He laughed, then they were silent again. He began. "Josephine," she said. "Josephine, have you heard the saying that every person has a soulmate?" She frowned at the word. He reached across the table and placed his hand on her collarbone. "Soulmate," he repeated slowly. "Some people, like me, we believe that everyone has a soulmate, wandering the earth. Not everyone finds theirs, but if you do, if you ever do, you recognize her immediately." "Like fate?" she asked. "Stronger even," he said. "Two souls wander the planet, and if you're very, very lucky, you find each other." He dropped his hand quickly and stood. "I'm sorry," he said, "I gotta go." She wanted to tell him to stop apologizing. She wanted to ask him, was it them he was talking about? Soulmates? When he turned and looked at her out there, something had happened. Was he saying it happened to him as well? Was this what people meant by love, she wondered? But by the time she raced outside to ask him these questions, he was gone. For 2 more Fridays he came to her, his hands cold from delivering ice. She brought him into the bed she shared with Vincenzo. That's her husband. She imagined leaving her husband, following Tommy Petroselli anywhere he wanted her to go. Everything vanished when they were together each Friday. On the fourth Friday, Josephine woke with her head spinning and the taste of vomit rising in her throat, and she knew. But she couldn't let Vincenzo see her like this, or he would know too. So she pretended to be asleep until he left for the mill. Then she buried her head in the chamber pot and threw up. That day, Tommy Petroselli did not come to her. He did not come the next week either, or the next. He never came again. People said his cousin Alfredo died from the Spanish influenza. People said Tommy died too. The blonde one, they said, the one who helped out for a while. And soon, a new Iceman came. On Valentine's Day, a month earlier than she'd expected, Josephine gave birth alone at St. Mary's Hospital. The baby was a girl with soft blonde hair, different from any of the other babies Josephine had had. So tiny, this beautiful baby girl. Her last two babies had been so big, but this one, so small and calm, her Valentina. Worse, when Josephine held her, she felt a surge of love that she had not felt so immediately with any of the other children. She loved this baby with every cell in her body. Josephine told the nuns, "Her name is Valentina. Today's her day, the day of love." "Sure," one nun said, "but the parents give them whatever name they want." "The parents?" Josephine asked. "Who are they?" "We can't tell you," she said. "Sorry. She's going to Vermont, though." The nun lowered her voice. "A very rich family. She's a lucky one." The nun handed Josephine her daughter, wrapped in swaddling. It was the only time she was allowed to hold her. Valentina struggled to open her eyes, but she managed, finally, and seemed to look right up into Josephine's. "I love you," Josephine whispered. That night, as the hospital slept, Josephine got out of bed and went down that long corridor. At the end, two nuns in white habits sat, sipping tea. The lights cast an odd and ugly green over everything, and the floors moved like the sea. Josephine had to hold on to the wall as she walked quietly down the hallway toward the nursery. She could see it, halfway between her and the nuns. Behind the long pane of glass, all the babies lay under heaters. Josephine wanted her baby. She'd felt the familiar tingle of her milk coming in, and she wanted to nurse her baby. She could not send her Valentina away. That was clear to her now. Let Vincenzo kill her. Let everyone whisper about this blonde-haired girl, but Josephine was going to keep her. Maybe when she felt stronger, because now she was dizzy and her legs wobbled, but soon she would be strong again, back to normal. Maybe then she would take Valentina and find Tommy Petroselli. "Look," she would tell him, "our daughter." "Mrs. Romaldi," one of the nuns said, her head jerked upright so that her wimple looked like wings. Josephine half expected her to take flight, to swoop down the hallway and carry Josephine back to bed. "I just want to see her again," Josephine said. The two nuns looked at each other. The bird-like one stood. "That's not possible," she said. "But I feel my milk coming in. I can nurse her now." The bird-like one was moving toward her, not flying, not soaring, but walking deliberately down the hall. "I'm afraid her parents have already come for her. They've taken her home, to Vermont." Where was Vermont? Josephine wondered. Panic rose in her throat. "But she's so little," she said. She wanted to say to Tommy, look at our daughter." The nun stood in front of her, blocking her. "I'm sorry," the nun said. "If I could just go to the nursery, to be sure she's really not there." But the nun was shaking her head, and with a firm grip on Josephine's arms, she was moving her back toward her room. "If I could just look," Josephine said again. The second nun appeared, and the two of them wrestled Josephine to the ugly green floor. The second one had a syringe in her hand, and while the bird held her down, struggling, fighting, calling her daughter's name, the second one plunged the needle into Josephine's thigh. Her mouth immediately filled with the taste of metal. The strange green lights above her pulsated. She felt spit drooling from her mouth. She felt suddenly very hot. "Can you walk?" someone was asking her. She was pulled to her feet and dragged along the hallway. Was she moving across the ocean, she wondered? Were they taking her back to the old country? Would her mother be waiting for her there? "Almost there," someone said. "Keep your eyes open now until we get you into bed again." She had come so far on her own, that it was taking forever to get back. Stay awake now, someone said. One more minute. Across the ocean was home. Across the ocean was war. They lifted her under her arms, up until she was flying now, and then cold all around her, white and cold as ice. Are there any Italians in Vermont? Josephine asked her daughter. This is years later. Elisabetta doesn't look at her. She gives her thin shoulders a little shrug. I don't know. Maybe not. Every day Josephine tries not to think about her lost daughter, but every day she finds herself unable to do that. She wonders if the girl is tall, if she eluded the outbreak of infantile paralysis last summer, if she likes to read or draw or climb trees. She wonders if the girl even knows that she, Josephine, exists. Or does she believe she is the true daughter of a woman who took her home from a hospital in Providence before Josephine even got to kiss her goodbye? Once, Josephine took the streetcar to Providence and walked almost 2 miles to that hospital. She waited while they found someone who spoke Italian, and then she told her story to this blank-faced stranger, a doctor in a rumpled suit, a man who listened without hearing. Records like this, he said finally, his Italian awkward and halting, they're sealed. He made a motion with his hands like he was zipping something shut. Capisco, he said. Then unseal them, Josephine said. I'm her mother. The man frowned, and Josephine could almost see into his head, almost see him translating in his brain. He said, actually, you're not. Josephine took a step back. How could he say that? She'd carried that baby inside her, pushed her out into the world. I want to speak to someone who speaks Italian, she said. You see, he said, you signed the papers. You gave her up. You stop saying you did this and you did that, Josephine said. I made a mistake and I want her back. But you gave her up, he said. With each accusation he made, Josephine grew wilder. She pushed him finally. He was a small man, a nothing man. She pushed him again, and this time he lost his balance. Where is she asked. When he didn't answer, she fell on top of him, her fists landing on his shoulders. Where is she asked. 2 men came, maybe policemen. She wasn't sure, and they lifted her up so that her legs kicked at the air, and her hands fell on nothing. Just get her out of here, the doctor, who spoke terrible Italian, said. Crazy wop, one of the men said. Oh, they're crazy, the other one said, gripping Josephine harder than was necessary. They're crazy, that's for sure. Josephine and Elisabetta eat dinner in a small cafe on the main street in Montpelier. Elisabetta has ordered something called an open-faced sandwich, turkey smothered in gravy on top of 2 pieces of toast. It looks nothing like an open face. Elisabetta, Josephine begins. Betsy, she says in a tired voice. Why are you so, Josephine struggles for the right word, unhappy, angry? Oh, Elisabetta moans, I'm just an idiot. Josephine chews the stringy pot roast, considering what to say, but her mind is blank. Outside the window, beneath a street lamp, a family walks past. The father is tall and lean and wears a red knit hat with a pom-pom on top. The mother has a long blonde braid down her back and giant fuzzy earmuffs, and she holds the hand of a girl in a powder blue coat. A light snow begins to fall, and Josephine feels like she is watching a movie of a family walking down a street in the snow in Vermont. The girl stops and slowly turns and faces the cafe. Josephine holds her breath. The little girl seems to be looking right at her. Josephine stares back. I'm here, she says silently, willing her words to leave the cafe and float out into the street where they will settle on the girl. A pretty moon, Elisabetta says, in that way she has that sounds like she's talking to herself and not to Josephine. Still Josephine nods. The moon is a perfect crescent, her favorite, silver in the blue-black sky. Now the little girl smiles. At me, Josephine thinks. She's smiling at me. Her heart lurches, and she gets to her feet, and without thinking she is moving toward the door, and then she is out the door, standing in the cold night air. But the family has continued walking, and the father is saying in a loud voice with a strange accent, "That's a good one, tell it again." And the girl's high-pitched voice drifts in the air. Why shouldn't turkeys do math, she asks. Turkeys, Josephine thinks, math, as she walks after them. Because, the girl says, if they add 5 plus 3, they get 8. And the three of them burst into a fit of giggles. The street is slippery with snow, slowing Josephine down. When she reaches the corner, they vanished. She looks in every direction, but the streets are empty. Did she imagine them? Did she imagine that little girl staring at her, finding her in the cafe window? Valentina, she says softly. Elisabetta runs up behind her. What the hell, she says. I thought I knew them, Josephine tells her. Knew them? Like you know people in Vermont? Josephine could not know it that night. But for many years to come, whenever she visited Chiara in Vermont, she would chase girls like this one, girls of a certain age. She would lean in closer to hear them talk. She would memorize their faces, their clothes, the sounds of their voices. She would search crowds at masses and train depots until she found one who might be hers. But in the end, they always disappeared, swallowed up as if they never existed in the first place. Perhaps this was the fate of mothers who lost their children. They spend the rest of their lives trying to find them, even though they know it's impossible. But isn't that faith? Isn't that hope? That maybe one of them will pause under a perfect moon on a snowy night in Vermont, and when she hears her mother's voice, she will turn toward it. Thank you, Italian friend. I'd love to answer any questions you might have. Yeah?
No, I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Okay.
Jan and I moved here a little over 40 years ago from Pennsylvania. And what you just did, and I know it happened to Jan as it did to me, we grew up in the very neighborhood you're talking about. Jan's in an Italian neighborhood, me in a Polish neighborhood. But 8 or 10 years before we left, to come here and raise our children, the neighborhood started getting diluted. And it was no longer, everybody knew the neighbor's kids, where they were going, what they were doing, where they were last night, what time they come in. And, which is one thing I know I miss, and I know Jan does too. When we come up here, it was a lot different. Not that there aren't those type of communities in Vermont, because there are. They go to Barrie and a few other places. But the people that migrated up here from the other states like we did,
Yeah.
I think experienced more of it, and it's dearly missed. And
Yeah.
it would make, my opinion is, if it was like that today, we'd have a whole lot better world.
Yeah. It is, it's sad. A few years ago, maybe it was last year, I can't remember, but my mom was robbed. And she didn't discover it for several months. Well, anyway, the police came, so we could file a report. And, he leaned in and he said to me, well, this neighborhood, it's a bad neighborhood. And no one knows anybody. And I was like, this neighborhood? I mean, I couldn't believe it, but it has become that.
But he wasn't too smart.
No. He wasn't smart.
I'm the one that was robbed.
Oh, all right, okay.
He thought I was an imbecile. He said, you stay here now, I want to talk to your daughter.
All
I
right.
wasn't even around.
Okay, but this is where she lives, in West Warwick, in Rhode Island.
It's in Rhode Island.
Yeah, in Rhode Island.
Well,
Yeah, I know, those little close neighborhoods. Well, when they came, at least in Rhode Island and in our town, groups of immigrants came and settled with other, immigrants from where they were from.
Right.
Right? And they worked in the factories, and we used to say, oh, that's the Polish church, the French church, the Italian church, the Portuguese, it was all very ethnic, even when I was in school, and of course that's all changed now, but that's the melting pot, that's what happened.
it was ethnic, but at the same time, you had the various ethnic neighborhoods, but at the same time, you had block parties that brought them all together
Yeah.
at some point in time.
Yeah, the laws.
And we still have, and there's a couple still going on up there. It was a Sacred Heart still has it. So my brother-in-law, who lives in Connecticut, goes in July down in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
He goes to that.
We still have a few too, yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I know it's true. Any questions or? Yes?
Are there short stories that didn't fit into this arc of a novel that might become something else?
No, I don't think so. I
You
really,
used them all.
there were two, and I just thought, no wonder these never sold. They're not good, you know, and I just sort of deleted them. They were not fully developed, you know. So no, they won't show up anywhere.
Do you write every day?
I do.
Virginia Woolf did. She wrote every single day.
I'm so happy to be compared to Virginia. That was lovely. You know, a thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that most of writing is not at the computer, it's really in your head. And I will go days and days just sorting out a plot point or a character development or what chapter should come next. I mean, I can think for a day about, did I make that happen too soon? Should I move that section? So that kind of thing you can't turn off. So in a way, I never stop writing because it's always kind of bubbling around, especially when I'm working on a novel, as I am now working on a new novel. I'm always kind of rearranging it and coming up with ways to change it and improve it. I try to actually write at the computer 2 hours a day. Sometimes that goal is impossible. It seems like not so long, you know, but sometimes I just can't do it with family stuff or book tour stuff or whatever. But I carry that computer like Velcro to my shoulder in case I get the 2 hours. I'm always ready to write.
Joan Didion said she wrote to impose herself on other people.
I suppose we do.
Do you ever feel like that? Like there's just something you have to say?
Yeah, I guess I would, it's interesting, I have to think about that quote a little more. I always say that I write about the things that keep me up at night.
Yeah.
And I think if I'm up at 3 in the morning thinking about this, there has to be at least one other person out there who's interested in this theme or this idea or this topic. So I try to, you know, attack those things. And I always say I want to write a book that I would like to read. You know, so I don't really think so much about who out there would like it or not like it, but I think ultimately, is this one of the books I would pick up, you know? So I impose it upon myself, I suppose, as well as others, right? Yeah. You were going to ask.
Yeah, and I just came up with another question. I'm going to go back to my first one. When you put them all together, was it difficult to come up with the order that they're in? That the final...
Yeah. You know, it wasn't because I was writing them with the idea of war. I was very interested, every time I approached one of these stories, about not people fighting wars, but the women left at home. And, you know, I grew up during the Vietnam War, so the parts in the 70s are really about teenagers during the Vietnam War. So they sort of fell into a natural order, and because most of them had been published somewhere, my editor could really only tackle and comment on the ones that hadn't been published, so there were only a couple that I really had to work on and rethink and revise, and those are the two that kind of got moved around a little bit. Yeah. It was an interesting way, you know, my first novel, Somewhere Up the Coast of Maine, which came out, I always say I carved it into my cave wall, it came out so long ago, but it was written the same way. So it's so funny that I guess I've made no progress in 30 years because I wrote that as stories based around the Vietnam War and people who didn't go to the war, you know? And so this process was so similar. I had all these short stories for that novel. Of course, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. This time I came with a little more authority after, you know, writing so many books. I hope I've learned a little bit that I could tackle it differently. But actually the process was very similar in the writing. So that was kind of funny for me, you know? And the books have the same sort of connectiveness. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about going between nonfiction and fiction? Because not everybody does that. A lot of people specialize in one or the other. You know what's different about it? What's the same writing process?
You know, it's funny. I never in a million years would have thought I'd ever write nonfiction. It never occurred to me in my dreams of being a writer. It was always novels. You know, it was big books like I loved to read when I was a kid. And my first publicist, Barb Berg, at Bantam Books, I loved that. Barb Berg, Bantam Books, there lots of B's, who was right out of college and just one of those on-target, amazing women who died very young, recently. She sat me down in her office one day and she said, "You should write nonfiction." And I laughed. I said, I don't know anything about writing nonfiction. She said, no, I'm not kidding. Whenever you're telling a story, like just think about how you tell a story. Well, funny, that same week we talked about that. It was right before my first novel came out, and we were talking about, you know, the publicity for it and stuff. I went to a cocktail party, and some guy was talking to me, and I was just telling him about being a flight attendant, which I still was, you know, and I was telling him about it. He's like, why would you be a flight attendant? You know, I was telling him all these funny stories. And after many minutes, he said, if you go home and write that down, I'll publish it. I'm an editor at the Washington Post. And I was like, okay. I mean, I was so like guileless. I'm like, okay. And so I can't even remember how I got it to him. Like, I guess I typed it, and, you know, I don't even know, like, did I hand deliver it? I have no clue, without email, how I did anything. How I got money out of it. How did I live? What was I doing? I have no idea. But I somehow sent it to him, and sure enough, it ran that Sunday in the style section of the Washington Post. And what he said to me, I'll never forget, you know, they edited it, obviously, and he called me and he said, why this is good is because you're not just telling anecdotes, but you're making sense of why you're doing this. And I remember thinking, I am? I mean, I was really like, okay. But that always stayed with me, that writing nonfiction, not journalism, right, but essays and personal stuff, isn't reporting facts, but it's making sense of events. And he gave me that observation. He said, you just did this naturally, but I want to tell you that's what makes it good. That's what we publish. And so from there, whenever I had some like story, I would think, can I make more of this? And often the answer is no, but sometimes it's, yeah, there's more to this than just the event itself. And so he just gave me sort of the courage to try it. And Barb Burr gave me the idea to try it, you know. Yeah. And I love writing nonfiction. You know, it's so fun for me. Like, I love sort of piecing, I don't know, writing nonfiction to me is almost like doing a jigsaw puzzle, which I also love, because you have all the pieces. I mean, they've happened to you. You know, unlike fiction, where so much of it is your imagination. But when you sit down to write an essay, you think, okay, here's what happened. I know the events. Now, what does that all mean? What do they, you know, what's the puzzle when I put those events together? And I love that sort of figuring it out and seeing the pieces come together. An editor emailed me for a literary journal, and she said, we'd love to have you in the journal. The theme is, are you ready for this? Skin. Can you write 5,000 words? That's a lot. About skin. And I would say, sure, I could do that. And I was like, skin? What? I mean, I have nothing to say about skin. Zero. So she asked me like 6 months ago, and it was due soon, like October 1st or something. So about July, I'm like, start thinking about skin. Start thinking, like, you gotta do this skin puzzle, you know. And the first thing I thought of was when I worked at Casual Corner. Do you remember Casual Corner stores at the mall? And Gloria Vanderbilt jeans had come out. I don't know, this was the first thing that came to my mind. And like, you were supposed to buy them so tight, and the women in the dressing room would get on the floor and like wriggle into them. And then they couldn't even get up because they couldn't bend in half. And like, I'd have to yank them up, these slightly, you know, not slender people. And I'd have to like hoist them up, and like, you know, it looked like they were gonna explode. And they'd say, oh, they fit like a second skin. And that was the first thing I thought of. So I'm like, what am I gonna do with this? Gloria Vanderbilt, but it, you know, it happened. So I went from there. But I love that challenge, you know, how can I get this to work? Oh, those jeans. $50. You know, they were so expensive in those days. $50. Crazy.
You have a great memory.
I do, I
For
did.
details.
For details.
You really do.
Yeah, although I also miss so much stuff. I always say jokingly, like, oh, you know, the keen eye of the writer, the keen eye of the observer, I didn't notice that, like, you know, our house got painted or something like really obvious. But I do remember, I remember things I had on when certain things happen. I don't know, it's just a funny, maybe it's a writer's thing that you
And
just
then
kind
you
of,
spin from them.
yeah.
You kind of, they make you, yeah, you spin.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, because how could I, skin and Gloria Vanderbilt jeans? I mean, that's funny even to me, like, that was weird.
Any more questions?
Any more questions?
Yes, did your mothers, did they ever catch the people who robbed you?
No.
Oh, now there's a book in there somewhere.
Oddly, I just got robbed last week.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah, it's a
When I
trend.
got robbed, I said, thank God I gave Ann my curls, because they would have taken that.
So
too.
that's what got robbed from me.
And thank God I gave Ann my bracelet, and I too. They took that too.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
They take
My
your
robber
fast.
took our window
My
box
robber.
off our window and crowbarred in. I mean, the house was locked up tight, wore glove, like kind of a professional job, and just ran through the house and took like the jewelry box, you know, my husband's jewelry box, I don't know what you call it, guys, I guess it's still a jewelry box, and just took that stuff, dumped my husband's gym bag clean, and used that bag, like our own bag to get the stuff out, like adding insult to injury. Yeah, yeah, anyway. Yes.
Maybe you have that behind me. You were talking about the women, they favored Mussolini and the Second World War.
Yeah, not women necessarily, but Italian Americans.
And then I'm kind of a bug on the Second World War. And then it turns out, obviously, they all turned against him.
Right.
When you research it, did you get into why, at what point they were starting to turn?
I don't remember, I probably did it, I mean, I wrote that story 15 years ago, so even though I'm good with details, I'm not really sure. They were not on his side during the war, it was earlier, it was in the
Yeah,
30s.
Once he got
Yeah.
into the war, but they joke about him getting the trains going on time.
Yeah, right, right. I mean, they were pretty desperate, and he came by, and I think, right, Mom, they saw him as sort of a savior, Mussolini.
Oh, I even know the song that they used to sing.
Oh, we're not gonna ask you. They sang a song?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
They used to have parades.
That I remembered you
They
telling
used to
me.
have parades, and they used to go around with, like, bags, and all the crazy Italians used to run out and put in their gold wedding rings and all the beautiful
Sent it.
gold jewelry. They used to melt it for Mussolini, but they used to sing a song. I'm not gonna.
I'll get later, I'll get her later,
I'll
buy her a
sing it.
glass of
I'll
wine.
sing
and
it to you.
You'll sing it to me tonight.
I'll march for you. Like
Oh,
they-
good. We can give you your gold. Oh, they stole it, okay.
But I'm sure those people were, as much as they loved being here, they missed their
Oh,
home
Oh,
they did.
and their
absolutely,
families,
yeah.
and it was their
True.
connection.
Oh,
It was-
yeah.
Yeah.
My great-grandmother, I remember how much she missed
Yeah.
Oh,
Italy.
gosh,
She wanted, yeah, she wanted to go
Yeah.
back so bad.
And they still had people there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the little parcels of
Just such a
land.
conflict, I'm sure.
Absolutely. That push and pull. And, you know, one of the things I think about this book, but about the immigrant story in general, is that although in An Italian Wife I'm writing about Italian Americans and that need to belong, it's really a book about all of us. Because in a way, we're all immigrants.
Sure.
We're all struggling to fit in, and it's really just capturing that feeling. The prop is being a true immigrant. But I think in a way, that's part of what we all struggle with, you know, that we want to belong somewhere.
It's an American dilemma.
Yeah.
Just in different generations,
That's right,
from different places.
that's right.
And
Thank you so
very
much, everyone.
It's great.
You guys, yeah. I love my perch.
If you can sign there, you can